There's a version of this story where you've already seen every sign and explained every single one of them away. Not because you weren't paying attention, not because you were naive, but because the signs that surface in this specific situation are designed, almost perfectly, to look like something else entirely. They look like stress. They look like personal growth. They look like her finally becoming more independent. And so you watch them appear one by one. You find a reasonable explanation for each one, and you walk forward into days and weeks that are quietly different from the ones before them, without ever stopping to ask why. Here is what makes this particular situation unlike most. The environment itself provides cover. A workplace gives every behavioral change a ready-made explanation. Late messages are work messages. New energy is professional ambition. Distance is just pressure from a project. The explanations aren't unreasonable. That's exactly what makes them dangerous. By the end of this video, you're going to be able to look back at the last 30 to 60 days and see them differently. Not with paranoia, not with suspicion toward every ordinary moment, but with genuine clarity about what certain patterns actually mean, including one sign, saved for later in this video, that almost no one ever names. I'm going to show you all 6. Before we look at what the signs are, there's something you need to understand first. Because without this foundation, the signs won't make sense in the way they need to. Most people think of infidelity as something that begins with a physical event, a decision, a moment. And they imagine that before that moment, everything was essentially normal. That's not how it works. By the time anything physical occurs, if it ever does, the emotional architecture has usually been under construction for months. Weeks of small conversations, shared frustrations about shared environments, the particular intimacy that forms between two people who navigate the same pressures every single day. That's where the real story begins, and that's where the behavioral signals live. The coworker dynamic is uniquely powerful for several reasons that have nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with structure. Daily proximity creates familiarity faster than almost any other social environment. Shared stress, deadlines, difficult managers, workplace tensions, produces a kind of bonding that psychologists call parasocial alliance, which simply means two people become emotionally aligned through a common external pressure. It feels like friendship. It feels like natural connection. And for a long time, it may genuinely be nothing more than that. Of course, context always matters here. Most close work friendships remain exactly that. What shifts the dynamic is when emotional intimacy begins substituting for, rather than existing alongside, the intimacy that belongs in your relationship. That distinction is important. You are not looking for evidence of a friendship. You are looking for a pattern of behavioral change. And that pattern doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. There is also a meaningful difference between an emotional affair and a physical one. And understanding that difference matters for everything that follows. Physical affairs are often discovered through evidence. Emotional affairs are discovered through shifts. Shifts in attention, in energy, in availability, in language. The signs in this video are all about shifts, which means you need to know what baseline looked like before you can see what has changed. The environment provides cover. That's the first thing to understand. Now let's look at what that cover actually hides. There's usually a name, and at some point you probably heard it more than once. The question isn't whether you noticed, it's whether you noticed when it stopped. This is typically the earliest signal, and it runs in 2 distinct phases that most men process as unrelated. Phase 1. The name appears. Not constantly, not suspiciously, but regularly enough that it becomes familiar. A story from a meeting. A funny observation this person made. A complaint about something they did. The name surfaces the way any colleague's name would surface in ordinary conversation about work. Naturally, without weight. You file it away. You don't think much of it. Phase 2 is what matters. The name stops, not gradually. Not because work topics dry up. It simply recedes, often around the same time that a few other things begin to subtly change. And here is the psychology behind that disappearance. Women self-monitor in ways that are both conscious and unconscious when they begin to recognize their own emotional investment in someone. When a name has been coming up too easily, too naturally, too often, there's an internal recalibration. A quiet decision, not always deliberate, to pull it back, to make the conversation around that person more managed. You might be thinking, couldn't she just have stopped mentioning him because nothing interesting happened? And sometimes, yes. The name disappearing in isolation means very little. But the disappearance combined with the other patterns you're about to hear, that combination has a different texture entirely. There's a variation of this signal worth knowing. Some women don't use the name at all from the beginning, particularly if they're aware of how much they're thinking about this person. Instead, you'll hear phrases like, someone at work, or one of my colleagues. Generic, unnamed, repeated. The absence of a specific identity where a specific identity should naturally exist is itself a form of concealment, often an unconscious one. The name that comes and then disappears is the opening note of a pattern. The next signal is where that pattern starts to acquire a shape. The phone itself isn't the sign. The change in how she relates to it, that's the sign. Most people, when they think about this particular signal, imagine something obvious. Screen flipped face down. New password suddenly appearing. And yes, those things can be present. But the behavioral shift that actually carries meaning is subtler than that. And it begins earlier than the obvious stuff. What you're looking for is a change in phone behavior relative to her own baseline. Not relative to what you think phone behavior should look like. Relative to what it used to look like with her, specifically. The phone that used to sit on the kitchen counter now travels to other rooms. Notifications that were once open are now silenced in ways that feel selective. There's laughter at the screen that doesn't get turned toward you. A small, private response that gets quietly managed before it becomes shareable. There's a particular pattern that appears in the timing of messages. Work hours become extended in the communication sense. Messages being checked and responded to at times that feel adjacent to work but aren't quite inside it. Early morning. Late evening. The framing is always professional. And sometimes it genuinely is. But when that pattern is new, when it wasn't there 3 months ago and now it's consistent, the framing alone doesn't settle the question. Here's the psychological reason this shift happens earlier in women than in men during an emotional affair. For women, the phone is where the emotional relationship actually lives. Text conversations, shared observations, the small running commentary that builds intimacy. That's not peripheral to the connection. It is the connection in its early stages. So protecting the phone isn't about hiding evidence of something that has already happened. It's about protecting something that is happening right now, in real time, and feels increasingly important to preserve. The instinct for most men when they notice this shift is to ask about it directly. And sometimes that's the right move. But asking too early, without understanding the full pattern, often produces a defensive response that closes the conversation before it opens. The phone protects the communication. What comes next protects something deeper. And it looks, from the outside, like nothing except a woman coming into her own. When a woman starts investing in her appearance, the instinct is to see it as a good sign. And sometimes it is. But the question you need to ask is, who is she upgrading for? This is the signal that gets misread most consistently. And the misread is understandable because the behavior itself is genuinely positive in isolation. New clothes, more care with hair and presentation, an interest in the gym that wasn't there before, more attention to how she looks before she leaves the house. If you notice this and feel pleased by it, that response is natural. The problem is that pleasure at the surface prevents you from looking at the direction, because here is what behavioral research consistently shows. When a woman enters an emotionally charged new connection, she becomes more self-aware and more invested in how she appears to the specific person generating that emotional charge. This isn't vanity in the ordinary sense. It's a form of investment signaling, the same mechanism that explains why people dress more carefully for a first date than for a Tuesday with someone they've known for a decade. The energy of new emotional attachment produces a corresponding desire to be seen more clearly, more favorably, by the person generating it. The detail that separates general self-improvement from directional self-improvement is simple, but requires honest observation. Notice when the effort is concentrated. Workdays, preparation is high. Weekends with you, preparation is ordinary, or lower than it used to be. The direction of the investment is the information, not the investment itself. Now, you might reasonably push back here. Maybe she just found a new sense of confidence. Maybe she's been inspired by something or someone entirely unrelated. Both of those things are possible. One instance of dressing well before a workday tells you nothing. A consistent pattern, more energy on the days she sees him, less on the days she doesn't. That pattern is harder to explain away as coincidence. Before we move to the next signal, there's an additional layer to this that most explanations skip over. The self-investment often extends to things he, meaning the coworker, has mentioned. A show he recommended. An interest he expressed. A casual comment about a type of music or food that she now seems to have discovered entirely on her own. Those small adoptions are worth noting. They indicate that she's tracking what he says in a way that goes beyond ordinary professional attention. Everything discussed so far involves things she adds: behaviors, appearances, investments. Sign 4 is about what she removes, and that removal will feel almost certainly like something you caused. Remember what was said at the start of this video, that there was one pattern most men not only miss, but actively misread as something else. Something about themselves. We are moving into that territory now. Emotional withdrawal doesn't always feel like distance. Sometimes it feels like she's finally fine on her own, and that, strangely, can hurt in a way you can't quite explain. This is the shift that men most frequently blame themselves for. And that self-blame is not entirely irrational, because the withdrawal does, in fact, often coincide with a period of relationship friction. What makes it so difficult to read correctly is that it presents as maturity. She stops bringing problems to you. She stops asking your opinion on things she used to consult you about. She stops including you in the small running narrative of her day, the minor frustrations, the funny observations, the ordinary texture of what happened while you weren't there. From a distance, this can look like growth, less dependence, more self-sufficiency. And those things are genuinely good in a relationship, which is precisely why this signal is so hard to name. The psychological reality is this: emotional needs don't disappear. When a woman becomes less emotionally present with you, it almost never means her emotional needs have reduced. It means those needs have found a different address. The conversations she used to bring to you, about frustrations, anxieties, small victories, are going somewhere. When the destination changes, the supply to your relationship drops. Here is the detail that complicates this further. During an emotional affair, physical intimacy between partners sometimes increases rather than decreases, at least temporarily. Guilt and the psychological need to maintain a normal-seeming surface can produce a compensatory warmth. This confuses the picture significantly. A man who is experiencing more physical closeness while simultaneously feeling a strange emotional distance often concludes that the emotional distance is something he's imagining. He is not imagining it. What you are looking for is the specific texture of emotional absence. Not coldness, absence. The difference between a partner who is upset with you and a partner who is elsewhere. One of those creates tension. The other creates a quiet that is much harder to locate. These 4 signs are all things she does or stops doing in a way you can observe over time. Sign 5 is different. It lives in language, and specifically in what happens when that language becomes protective. Listen to how she talks about him. Not what she says, how she says it. And pay particular attention to what happens when someone else says something critical. Language is where emotional investment becomes audible. And there are two specific patterns that surface when a woman has developed a meaningful bond with a coworker. The first is unprompted defense. In a conversation where no one has attacked this person, where his name comes up neutrally, or where a mild observation is made, her response carries more energy than the moment required. A slight sharpening in tone. A correction that wasn't necessary. A defense that arrives before a criticism was even fully formed. That disproportionate response is the signal, not the defense itself. When we feel emotionally aligned with someone, criticism of them registers as a kind of personal criticism, as if their reputation and ours have become linked. The brain processes it as a mild threat. And the response to a mild threat is protection. What you're witnessing in those moments is not a character trait. It is an involuntary disclosure of emotional loyalty. The second pattern runs in the opposite direction. Complete refusal to engage with this person as a subject at all. Neutral questions. How was the team meeting? Did that project get sorted? Met with minimal, flat answers that close the topic immediately. This isn't the same as disinterest in discussing work generally. It's a specific deflection around a specific person. And that specificity is the information. Of course, some people are simply private about their professional lives. One or two instances of short answers about a colleague mean nothing. But when the same topic produces the same flat, abbreviated response consistently, and when that consistency is new, not how she has always been, the pattern deserves attention. There's a variation worth naming. Comparison language. Moments where qualities of this person are mentioned in ways that implicitly contrast with yours. Not directly, rarely directly, but in the texture of how his competence, his humor, his way of handling something is described. The comparison is often unconscious, but once you've heard it twice, you won't mistake it for coincidence again. Everything covered so far has involved behaviors that are observable from a normal relational distance. The sixth sign requires a different kind of attention, because what it looks like, from the inside, is you losing your grip on your own memory. This last sign is the one that makes men question their own memory. And that specific feeling, that specific confusion, is itself the signal. What happens in the later stages of an emotional affair is a quiet but systematic revision of the relationship narrative. Not through lies exactly, through reframing. Old problems, which were always part of the ordinary friction of any long-term relationship, suddenly become defining patterns. Flaws that were accepted, worked around, even affectionately acknowledged, become talking points in a new story she is constructing. A story in which the relationship was already failing long before anything changed. You might start hearing things like, "You've always been like this," or "I've felt this way for a long time," or "You never really understood me." These statements may contain elements of truth. Most relationship criticisms do. But their sudden emergence, their frequency, and their tone feel different from ordinary conflict. They feel like they're building a case. Here is the psychology behind this, and it's important to understand that this is not always a calculated strategy. For many women, this narrative revision is a self-protective mechanism, a way of resolving the internal conflict between the relationship they're in and the emotional pull they're feeling. If the relationship was already broken, the emotional investment elsewhere feels less like a betrayal and more like a reasonable response to an already failing situation. The narrative revision isn't always dishonest. It is almost always unconscious. What makes this sign so disorienting is the effect it has on you. You begin defending a version of yourself and a version of your relationship that doesn't match your own experience of it. You find yourself in arguments that feel unfamiliar, not because the topics are new, but because the weight being assigned to them is new. You walk away from these conversations feeling like you've misremembered your own life. That feeling, that specific disorientation, is not a sign that you were wrong about the relationship. It is a sign that something external is being used to rewrite it. This is the sign that closes the loop opened at the very beginning of this video. You can now look back at the last 30 to 60 days and see those moments for what they were. But recognizing the signs is only half of what was promised. The other half is knowing what to do. And the right response is almost certainly not what your instincts are telling you right now. Knowing the signs matters. But what you do with that knowledge, that's what actually determines what happens next. The instinct most men feel when they recognize these patterns is to confront immediately. Directly, urgently, with everything they've observed laid out as evidence. That instinct is understandable. It is also, in most cases, the move that produces the worst outcome. Not because confrontation is wrong, but because confrontation without clarity hands the other person the ability to reframe your awareness as paranoia. There are 3 things that actually serve you here. The first is observation before confrontation. Not indefinite silence, but a deliberate pause in which you watch the pattern without reacting to it. This is not passivity. It is the discipline of gathering enough clarity that when you do speak, you are speaking about a pattern, not a suspicion. A pattern is much harder to dismiss than a feeling. The second is recalibration of your own presence. This is the variable most men overlook entirely. Because when you suspect something is wrong, the natural response is to withdraw, to become quieter, more watchful, slightly more distant. That withdrawal, however understandable, often accelerates the very dynamic you're trying to reverse. Emotional investment follows attention. If your attention has been somewhere else for months, not through any failure of character, just through the ordinary drift of long-term relationship life, reclaiming it is not a manipulation. It is the one thing that is genuinely within your control. The third is the direct conversation, and the framing of it matters more than the content. You are not presenting a case. You are not making an accusation. You are making an observation about specific behavioral changes that you have noticed over a specific period of time, and you are saying plainly that something feels different, and you want to understand what it is. That framing keeps the conversation open. Accusation closes it. There's a final distinction worth sitting with. There is a difference between a relationship that is worth fighting for and one where the fighting itself is the answer, where the act of naming what you've seen, clearly and without cruelty, is what this moment requires regardless of what comes after it. You don't have to decide which one you're in right now, but you do have to be willing to see clearly. Everything covered in this video points to a single underlying truth. When a woman is becoming emotionally involved with someone outside the relationship, she does not disappear. She shifts. The energy doesn't reduce, it redirects. And every sign you've heard today is a form of that redirection making itself visible, if you know where to look. A name that comes and then goes. A phone that becomes private in new and specific ways. An investment in appearance that runs in one direction. An emotional withdrawal that presents as independence. A language that becomes protective around one person. And a narrative that begins quietly revising the past to justify the present. None of these signs in isolation is conclusive. All of them together, as a pattern, are something you deserve to see clearly. You're not leaving this video with a reason to be suspicious of every ordinary moment. You're leaving with the ability to tell the difference between ordinary moments and ones that have been quietly meaning something else. Which of these 6 signs felt most familiar to you, even if you explained it away at the time? Tell me in the comments. You don't have to share details, just the number. If this gave you something real, subscribe. Because on this channel, we don't deal in surface explanations. Every video goes deeper into how female psychology actually works, so that what you see in your relationship you actually understand. In the next video, I'm going to show you something that surprises almost every man I explain it to. Why a woman can show 0 signs of any of this, be completely faithful and still be emotionally gone. That kind of distance has its own signs. And that video is coming next.